Now, if we analyze the scientific method, we're going to find a whole class of entities that cannot be described or explained in purely physical terms, because they're parts of the process for looking at physical objects. So what are these entities? Well, first of all, conscious faculties, perception, seeing, hearing, and so on. Then second thing is mental process, thinking, feeling, willing, accepting thoughts, rejecting thoughts, and purposeful activity. A scientist has to perform so many activities that wouldn't take place in the ordinary course of things. Conscious faculties. Next thing is that the conscious faculties don't just work by themselves. It takes an effort, a personal effort to see. It takes an effort to perceive in a particular way. It takes an effort to think clearly and consistently. It takes an effort to act in a specific way. Michael Faraday, he was one of the early scientists, he said, you can't be a scientist unless you can use a saw as a file and a file as a saw. That was a state of advancement at that time. So a scientist has to act. But he has to know how to act. That means I am acting. Who's this I? This is the conscious self. So we define the conscious self as the entity that organizes coordinates the conscious faculties. This is also a part of science, the I. Also, my I exist, and this I, this self-existent I, can't be explained physically. But you also exist, you also exist, you also exist. There's so many, there's a myriad individual self-entities in this world, and they can't be explained, their existence can't be explained in physical terms only. So then there's a basis for their existence. Similarly, not only they're existing, but we're also communicating with each other very closely. Just like computers, they have to have a protocol, a common program, and a common network in order to communicate with each other over the internet. So similarly, we have to have common protocols, we have to have a network. What is that? So there's an entity which is coordinating the individual selves. Also, we have to look at matter. Matter is also part of the basis of the scientific process, because the body is made of matter, the apparatus is made of matter, and the whole field in which we're operating is made of matter. So matter is part of the basis of the scientific method, the objective method. That means you can't describe matter completely objectively, and you can't explain where it comes from objectively. Or you can say, well, of course we can measure matter objectively. We're doing it all the time with our instruments. We weigh it, we measure its temperature, and so on. Yeah, but what are you measuring in? Degrees centigrade or degrees Fahrenheit? Grams or ounces? Feet or meters? These are subjective choices, and the measuring process itself is also a subjective process. So when you describe matter, so-called objectively, when you measure matter, you're doing it in subjective terms. So then there are laws of matter which operate in objective, in terms of objective entities, like mass. What's the difference between mass and weight? It's an abstract entity. So the laws of nature are operating in terms of abstracts. So then it must be an abstracting entity, the basis of the laws of nature. So what is it that maintains the existence of the individual selves, the community of selves and relationships between selves, and the laws of nature? So this also, it necessarily must be a conscious entity. So this we can refer to as the universal self. And the body of the scientist is also involved in science. So therefore, since it's part of the process, the objective scientific method can't explain and describe the body completely either. So then we can we'll predict that if scientists investigate the appearance of these entities, they'll conclude that they're formed by some inconceivable potency, some potency which they can't actually measure. Now here we have to see the difference between something which, well, maybe will make some progress, we can advance, in a little while we'll be able to find out. Sometimes the materialists, they complain about, for example, the creationists. They say they believe in God, in the God of the gaps. Something, okay, we haven't explained it so far, and the creationists rush in and say, see, God did it. So they said, no, but we will explain it. But there are some things that they can't explain in principle. So we predict that all of these entities that I've just described, when the material scientists, mechanistic scientists, try to explain how these things appeared and how they function purely in physical terms, they'll always meet not just with difficulties, but with insuperable difficulties, insuperable obstacles. Especially, one is either they won't be able to state their theory consistently, because there's logical fault in the theory. It's a pseudo-theory made up of pseudo-statements. Or they'll come up with insuperable odds. What do we mean by insuperable odds? If you have odds against an event of, say, 10, 1 with 100 zeros against, that's insuperable. That's inconceivable. The scientists say that there's 10 with 80 zeros of particles in the whole universe. That means atoms, electrons, neutrons, protons, and like that. So, the totality of all possible events in space and time, 10 to the 150 is a generous estimate. If you have numbers greater than 10 to the 150, these are inconceivable. They're not numbers in the sense that they correspond with something here in the physical world. So if you come up with numbers like 40,000 zeros to 1 against, these are inconceivable, and that's also an insuperable number. It's insuperable odds. It means that no matter how much they advance, they'll never make a consistent theory in the face of these odds. So we can make a theory, a falsifiable theory of, which we can call the theory of inconceivable potency. That when the physical scientists investigate these entities, they will always run up against these insuperable odds, either logical or mathematical or both. And these insuperable obstacles will prevent them, in principle, from ever stating a consistent theory how these things have come together by physical interactions alone. I'll just go very, very briefly some of the arguments that I advanced before. The conscious faculties, seeing the function of the mind, activity. Scientists themselves admit that they haven't made progress in explaining these things physically. On the contrary, there's good evidence that we should regard them as elementary, irreducible. For example, David Chalmers, working in the area of psychology, he says that we should accept experience as an irreducible instead of trying to explain where it comes from. Similarly, Arthur Young, who invented the Bell helicopter, he says that it's no longer consistent. We can't say that it's consistent to think that the universe consists of atoms which are acting just by physical interactions. He says we have to take action as an irreducible element. In fact, Eccles, for example, Sir John Eccles, he's a Nobel neurophysiologist, he's given good evidence how the self, the non-physical self, interacts with the body through the medium of the brain. And his theory corresponds quite closely to the Vedic idea that the self interacts with the body through the pranas, which are, you could say, life airs. They're very, very subtle currents, energetic currents through the body. The problem with trying to explain how the conscious faculties come by objective, some physical way, is that you can't state the theory. If you want to explain in objective terms where the conscious faculties come from, for example, perception, but how can you describe perception? You can't describe perception. How can you describe the mind? How can you describe an activity from outside? Because the description is itself an action. So the insuperable obstacle here is that you just can't state your theory. They can't state their theory in objective terms. They can't say what they're talking about. So they're never going to be able to explain in purely objective terms.